highway rest stop. I've driven the Great Northern Highway countless times, a long stretch of emptiness cutting through the Australian Outback. It's the kind of road where you lose yourself to the monotony of red dust and endless horizon. But one night it became the place I'll never forget. I was driving back to Perth from a mining gig up north. It was late, probably around 11 p.m, and the road was dead quiet. The fuel gauge was creeping towards empty, so when I saw a flickering sign for a rest stop a few kilometers ahead, I decided to pull over. I figured I'd top up on petrol and grab a coffee to push through the final leg of the drive. The rest stop wasn't much. A single fluorescent light buzzed above the pumps, casting everything in an eerie, sickly glow. There was a convenience store with a large window, but the interior was dark. A handwritten sign taped to the door read, "Back in 15 minutes." I sighed, frustrated, but decided to wait. The night was too quiet, the kind of silence that feels oppressive. I leaned against my car, scrolling through my phone when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced around, but there was no one, just the dim light of the rest stop and the dark void of the Outback beyond. I shook it off, chalking it up to tiredness, and turned back to my phone. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the far side of the pumps. It wasn't loud, but in the silence it cut through like a knife. I froze, my eyes scanning the area. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it had started. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. No answer. Then I saw movement, a shadow, low to the ground, darting behind one of the pumps. It was quick, too quick for me to get a proper look, but it was there. I climbed back into my car, locking the doors. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was probably just a stray dog or some other animal. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I turned the ignition, ready to leave, but the car didn't start. It sputtered once, twice, and died. My stomach dropped. I tried again. Nothing. The tapping came back, louder this time, closer. It wasn't coming from the pumps anymore. It was coming from the window behind me. I whipped around, and that's when I saw him. A face, barely visible in the dim light. A man's face, gaunt and wild, staring at me through the back window. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his lips moving as if he were whispering something. For a moment, I was paralyzed, too terrified to move. Then I realized his hand was pressed against the glass, his fingers spread wide. As I watched, his nails scraped down the window, making a high-pitched squeal that sent shivers down my spine. "Let me in," he whispered. The sound wasn't muffled by the glass, it was inside the car, clear and sharp in my ear. I screamed, scrambling away from the window, but the man didn't move, he just kept staring, his eyes boring into mine. His mouth twisted into a grin, revealing teeth that were broken and yellow. "Let me in," he said again, louder this time. Suddenly, the car rocked violently, as if something or someone had slammed against it. The man's face disappeared from the window, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the car, fast and deliberate. I grabbed my phone and dialed 000, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The operator answered, but before I could speak, the signal cut out, just static. Then the man's face was back, this time at the driver's side window. He pressed his forehead against the glass, his breath fogging up the surface as he stared at me, unblinking. He started tapping again, this time with something metallic. I glanced down and I saw it, a long, rusty blade, the point scratching against the window. "Let me in, or I'll make you come out," he hissed. I was trapped. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I fumbled with the ignition again, praying for the car to start, but it was dead. The man's tapping then turned to banging, each blow rattling the car. And then the worst part, I looked into the rearview mirror and saw another figure, a second man, crouched in the back seat, his head tilted unnaturally, as if his neck was broken. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and his mouth opened in a wide, silent scream. I bolted out of the car, adrenaline taking over, and ran. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to get away. The Outback stretched endlessly in every direction, but I didn't care. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast, and the sound of laughter, low and guttural, echoing in the empty night. Eventually, I stumbled onto the highway, waving frantically at an approaching truck. The driver stopped, pulling me into the cab, and I broke down, sobbing and babbling about the men at the rest stop. When the police arrived, my car was gone. There were no signs of anyone, just deep scratches on the asphalt near where I'd parked. The officer who took my statement listened quietly, his face impassive, but his eyes betrayed something else, something he wasn't saying. "You're not the first," he admitted after a long pause. "The rest stop's been trouble for years. People go missing, cars are found stripped and dumped miles away, but we've never caught anyone. It's like they just vanish." I tried to ask more, but his radio crackled to life, summoning him back to the station. Before he left, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Stay off these roads at night," he said. "And if you see a rest stop like that again, keep driving. No matter how tired you are, just keep driving." The truck driver who had picked me up gave me a ride to the nearest town. As I stepped out of the cab, he handed me my backpack, the one I thought I'd left in the car. "You dropped this," he said, his brow furrowed. I hadn't dropped it. It had been in the back seat, zipped shut when I fled the car. I opened it cautiously, my blood turning cold. Inside was a single item, a broken, rusted blade, smeared with dirt and something darker. A crumpled scrap of paper was wrapped around the handle. "We'll find you," it said. The truck driver swore he didn't put it there. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the motel walls, every distant shuffle set my nerves on edge. I forced myself to move on the next day, pushing the experience to the back of my mind, trying to convince myself it was over. But was it? Because sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the soft, rhythmic tapping on my windows and on my door, and I can't help but wonder, did I ever really get away, or are they just waiting for the right time to finish what they started? In the vast, empty expanse of the Australian Outback, a place where the land seems to stretch forever. It's a place where the sun burns hot during the day and the cold creeps in once it sets. But the most chilling part of the Outback isn't the heat or the cold, it's the silence. At least it was silent, until we heard the whistling. I was with a group of friends, roughing it out in the desert for a few days of camping. No roads for miles, no phones, just the open sky, red earth, and the stars above. We set up camp near an old dry creek bed, surrounded by grass and scattered rocks. A place as desolate as it was beautiful, the perfect spot to get away from it all. The fire cracked as we sat around, beers in hands, trading stories of our travels. Everything seemed peaceful at first. The only sound was the occasional rustle of the wind or a distant animal call. But as the night wore on, my friend Ben, who had been strangely quiet all evening, suddenly sat up. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The others fell silent, listening. There was nothing at first, just the soft snap of the fire and the buzz of the crickets. But then, faintly, we heard it, a soft, high-pitched whistle that seemed to come from somewhere far in the distance. The sound was strange, unnatural, like the wind itself was trying to mimic a human tune. It was slow at first, almost like a warning. "Probably just the wind," said Sarah, shrugging and leaning back in her arms. But Ben wasn't convinced. He stared into the dark, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I don't know. It's not normal," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He had been to the Outback before, and he knew how dangerous it could be to ignore strange noises, especially at night. The whistling grew louder. It was as if it was getting closer, closer with every passing moment, but no one saw anything. Not a shadow, not a figure, just the moonlight reflecting off the dry, cracked earth. Then all at once, the wind picked up. The fire flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the camp. And there, among the sound of the howling wind, the whistling stopped. "That's weird," my friend Sarah muttered, uneasy now. That didn't sound like the wind anymore. Before anyone could respond, Ben stood up, his face pale. "It's not the wind," he said, voice shaking. "It's following us." We looked at him, confused. Then, one by one, we heard it again. A whistle, sharp and clear. Right behind us, it sounded like it was coming from just beyond the firelight. The kind of whistle someone might make if they were trying to get your attention. Panic set in. We grabbed our torches and shone them into the darkness, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement, just the cold, empty vastness of the Outback. The whistling came again, closer now. So close that it almost felt like someone was standing right behind us, just out of sight. Someone or something. Ben backed away from the fire, his eyes wide with terror. "Over there," he whispered. "I think I see something." Had someone been stalking our camp? Watching us and whistling? I asked. There's no way, said Sarah. That's insane. But at that moment, the whistle came again, louder and more insistent. Without thinking, we grabbed our things, ready to leave. But as we stood up, the whistling stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was as if the entire world had paused. Then, through the quiet, we heard it. The sound of footsteps crunching through the dirt. Slow, deliberate steps, and then a voice.
G'day.
We turned to face the figure standing just outside the firelight. A man, tall and thin, with sunken eyes and a crooked smile. His clothes were tattered like he'd been wandering the Outback for decades. The man took another step closer. You shouldn't be out here, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind.
The Outback takes what it wants, you know. It always takes.
No way we were going to stay and find out what he meant by that, so we ran. We ran like we'd never ran before, through the dirt and the scrub until the first light of dawn broke across the horizon. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we looked around. No sign of the man, no sign of anything, just the quiet, empty Outback. We got back to our car and vowed never to return. I hope to God that I never hear that creepy whistle ever again.